Well, again, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to the labor market and unemployment presentation, which is the Fox Alliance's quarterly economic outlook for the third quarter of 2022. We are grateful that you've taken the opportunity today to join us, and we look forward to walking through this interesting topic as we kick off the third quarter here. We're going to have three presenters today. Myself, I'm one of the wealth advisors here at the Fox Alliance. And then we'll move over to Laura shortly through the presentation. Laura Cooper, who is also one of our wealth advisors here, and then Josh Renfro, one of the partners at the firm, will be wrapping up the presentation. We're going to take a look at the history of labor and employment here in the United States to kick things off, and then we'll walk into talking about kind of where we are today and some of the impacts or some of the factors that have led to the labor and unemployment environment that we find ourselves in right now. And then we'll wrap things up talking about the conclusions that we should draw from the information that we reviewed. And then also with just a few other bonus points at the end that we think are some interesting observations for us to share. We will be taking questions at the end of the conversation today. So if you have those, please feel free to send questions directly to my email address there on the screen, max@thefox Alliance. Well, to go ahead and get things started, let's take a look at the history of labor and unemployment here in the United States, in our country. And for any history buffs out there, I want to apologize. I am painting with very broad strokes here, so it is not terribly precise in the eras that I've broken down. But there are about three broad eras when we look at kind of the economic history of the United States. If we look from the 1600s through roughly the mid 1700s, we were a more agrarian economy. I'd say the most significant economic activities were really small scale farming and artisan handcrafts. And most of that activity was centered around small and medium sized villages. It was very localized, a lot of subsistence farming. You didn't see many people traverse beyond their city or village. We moved to the next era, which was really the Industrial Revolution. That was the mid 1700s through the early 1900s. And this really was a major transformation when it came to the patterns of labor and family life. This really ushered the nation and many parts of the world into the modern era. Growing populations really necessitated an increase in agricultural productivity. You saw large-scale agriculture really begin to replace subsistence farming. And as a result, many people that had historically farmed made the decision to head for towns and cities to find more long-term employment. We saw factory production become more and more prevalent. And this is really kind of when the, quote, middle class came on the scene. And an important thing to note about this is that while international trade was increasing, goods were still largely produced and manufactured within the United States, still very focused here within our nation. But that was the Industrial Revolution really transforming a lot of family and labor life. We then make the transition over to the final era, which really began in the early 1900s through today. You can classify it as really the information age or the modern times that we live in. And, you know, as we entered these modern times, we really began to see a shift in the types of jobs throughout our economy. Back in the industrial age and kind of when those big transformations began taking place, we saw jobs that were typically low discretion. They required little decision-making and were really analyzed and broken into simple tasks which required very little thinking or judgment on the part of workers. Think an assembly line, and it's a very repetitive process, not a lot of discretion required. Move into the information age, and jobs, in contrast, were really high discretion. They become high discretion, and they require considerable thinking and decision-making on the part of workers. We really began to see an increase in the number of what's referred to as white-collar workers. White-collar workers now represent about 45% of the U.S. workforce. And this was really kind of when the advent of the knowledge worker came on the scene. Now, as this shift in the working environment changed, much of the work that had previously been done by individuals was being taken over by machines. And in addition to that, international labor outsourcing became prolific, especially in manufacturing and supply chain sourcing. And what we also saw at this time, and what we're experiencing now, is really a shift in work life and kind of the environment or the approach that many people take to work, meaning less of an 8 to 5 job, a lot more flexibility. Think work from home, flexible hours, etc. And this kind of sets the stage for what we're going to be looking at today, and brings us to the point of where are we today when it comes to the labor market and the environment. Let's take a look at the unemployment rate and look back. This takes us back to the late 1940s, just after the World War II and after the Great Depression, and take a look at where we are today. Our unemployment rate is about 3.6%, and you can see that that's one of the lowest we've seen in the last 80 years or so. Many people would suggest that we're technically at full employment, which means that everybody that really is looking for a job has found one. But take a look at this spike here during COVID. This was the highest unemployment that we had seen really since the Great Depression by a large margin. It was a really significant thing, but you can see it was relatively short-lived, and we've since made our way back down to where we are today. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is that unemployment statistics can be misleading. When we look at this 3.6%, we have to ask ourselves, what does this actually include? And what we're looking at here is an employment statistic known as U3. It takes into consideration everybody that doesn't have a job but has been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks. Now, if you look at the U6 on the right-hand side, many people would suggest that this is a more relevant picture of unemployment, because what this does is it incorporates people who would be described as discouraged workers, people who really want to look for or want a job, but have not been looking for one in the last 12 months, in the last 4 weeks, but they have looked for one in the last 12 months. Be described as discouraged workers. It also includes people who are, quote, underemployed, people who desire to be either full-time employed or desire to be full-time employed or have a better job, but they're stuck at part-time for one reason or another. The important thing to recognize here is that whether we're using 3.6 or the 6.7, we need to compare that to history to get a good feel for where we are today. All to say, that's where we are right now. What we'd like to do now is shift into an understanding of what's leading, or what has led us and it is contributing to the really tight labor market that we find ourselves in right now. We're going to be taking a look at 5 different factors. And the first one is deglobalization. We really want to talk about the way that this particular factor is influencing the tight labor market we find ourselves in. What we've seen is over probably really for the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've seen this move towards globalization and really the countries of the world working together to benefit everyone. Well, over the last probably 10 years or so, we begin to see a move away from that. And some things are starting to give indications that we're likely to see deglobalization going forward. Just think about the trade war that we've had with China, a rise of populism and nationalism, really driving people to be more focused on their country as opposed to the globe overall. Think about the supply chain fragility that we saw during the pandemic. And that's really driving a lot of countries to decide, you know what, instead of being reliant on these other countries, let's try to bring a lot of the production and those sorts of things in-house. Another interesting fact is that as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, we've seen something described as the weaponization of the financial system. And I'm going to just give a brief overview of what this looks like. But the US dollar has really been for many, many years now considered the world reserve currency. It was a place that you could put your money and have confidence that when you need it, you'll be able to get to it. Well, when the Russia-Ukraine war started, we had really an unprecedented thing happen. And it was Russian assets of the Russian federal government, and also assets of individuals, of the Russian oligarchs, were actually seized that were denominated in US currency or in other currencies. And that's really going to create some big waves in the financial systems going forward. When we used to have the US dollar as a world reserve currency, people had confidence in it that they were going to have access to their money when they could. And when we see this weaponization of the financial system, that's only going to promote more and more nationalism and a move away from this globalism that we've seen over the last over the last 50, 60, 70 years. So what this is likely to lead to over the long term is less outsourcing and more insourcing. And this is really just going to further tighten the US labor market going forward. It's something that's led to what we've experienced today, and I think going to be more of a consideration going forward. So I'll go ahead and shift it over to Laura to continue this conversation. She's going to cover the next several factors influencing the labor market today. Laura, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Max. As Max said, I will be covering factors 2 through 5, starting with the baby boomer generation retiring. And the baby boomer generation is the second largest generation in the United States, just behind millennials, excuse me, at 21.8% of the US population. In the United States, 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 every single day. So as you can imagine, that is a natural progression of the second largest generation coming out of the labor force and moving into retirement. But we've also seen those in the past 2 years, due to the pandemic, people age 55 and older are being pulled forward into retirement a lot quicker. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, as we know, the pandemic affected older individuals at a much higher rate than younger folks. And a lot of people who were working and maybe 2 to 5 years from retirement decided to just go ahead and retire for health concerns and health risk. But also in 2020, we saw a significant significant increase in the number of, in the amount of assets in the United States. Even though we had a really large drop in the S&P 500, over 30%, we ended the year 18% positive in the S&P. And real estate, we saw, has boomed over the last 2 years, and that boom started in 2020. So with that, a lot of people who maybe were 2 years from retirement saw their 401ks and their real estate assets growing at a much higher rate than they may have expected, and decided, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and retire. And looking at the working population of age 55 and older, pre-pandemic, that population was right at around 39%. And by the end of the pandemic, it dropped 6% to 33%. And one of the last things that I'll mention here is in November of 2021, we saw the largest number of people leave the US labor force during the pandemic. 3.6 million people left, and 90% of those folks were age 55 or older. So not only are we seeing a natural progression of the second largest generation leaving the labor force, we are also seeing that number being pulled forward due to the pandemic. And that's creating an issue in the United States as far as the number of people available to work. The third factor is stagnating US population. And US population growth was at its second lowest rate over the last decade at 0.35%. Very, very slow growth in the United States. And this is a trend that we've seen after 2008. 2008 being a recession and a financial crisis. A lot of people were pushed back in their family planning, or a lot of people who thought they were going to have children decided not to have children. And so we've seen that as a trend really over the last decade. But this is really important because looking at the breakdown of population growth by age in the US over the last decade, we're seeing a lot slower or stagnating growth in folks 55 and younger. And again, with the baby boomer population moving out of the workforce and the millennials moving into their more higher earning years, our generation, the millennial generation, needs to be replaced at some point. And that's all being taken, that all happens right now as Gen X and millennials start to have more children. If we start to see either decreasing or even stagnating population growth of the younger generations, long-term, that can have a huge effect on US labor markets and on the US economy as a whole. The fourth factor is a shrinking and shifting global population. Now, countries like Italy and Japan have been shrinking for years. Their populations have been shrinking for years. But countries like China are more recently having decreasing population of working age individuals. And this is a lot a lot of reason for this is due to China's one-child policy. China did not do a very good job of incentivizing and encouraging their citizens to have more children after the one-child policy was lifted. And again, when you look at the generation then coming to working age, that leads to a decreasing number of working age population. Now, why is this important in the United States? In the US, we have been very happy to import cheap labor from China for decades. However, if we see a decrease in the working population, that's a decrease in the labor force available for us to utilize. And that means that we either have to find another source to import that labor from, or pay more for that labor over time. As you can imagine, paying more for the labor that we've been importing from China, again, has huge economic implications long-term. And finding that labor force is not a very easy thing to do. So that's incredibly important for our long-term labor markets. One other thing that I'll mention is decreasing immigration into the United States. And if we look here on this chart, from 2020 to 2021, we saw the lowest increase in both natural increases, which are births versus deaths, and immigration. And a couple of reasons for the immigration piece. One, obviously a pandemic. People are less likely to immigrate during a pandemic, but this is a trend that, as we see, has been decreasing and on the decline really since 2015. And the biggest reason for that, obviously, are tighter immigration policies. We've seen a lot tighter immigration policies over the last 5 years than we had previously. So immigration is important as far as growing U.S. population, and 77% of immigrants in the United States are legal immigrants that contribute to the labor force in some way. So that's important long term. The last factor that I will go over is employee selectiveness. As Max mentioned, we're in a very tight labor market right now. And there was a statistic earlier this year that showed that for every 3 jobs that were available on the market, 1 was going unfilled. And the biggest question was why? Why are employers having a really hard time finding work? Is it because we just don't have enough people? Or is it for another reason? And the biggest reason is employee selectiveness. If you look at the jobs that are available, if an employer is putting a job up, they really need that job filled, they're going to do what they have to as far as salary and benefits to fill that position. If it's a job that they might want to fill, but they don't need to fill it, then they might put a skilled job at minimum wage and hope that someone takes it. And so this quote from Aaron Sojourner states, "I can want a 65-inch TV for $50, but it doesn't mean there's a TV shortage. It means I'm not willing to pay enough to get someone to sell me a TV." And so there are jobs out there where folks are wanting to hire skilled workers for minimum wage, and they're not getting filled. And it's not because necessarily we have a labor shortage, even though we are in a tight labor market. It's more for the fact that the incentives are not enough to lure people to that job, or even for retirees to lure them out of retirement. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh to tie it all together.
Thanks, Laura. One thing I will point out is, obviously, I want to be clear, we're not saying that there aren't industries where there are labor shortages. There clearly are. But as a broader spectrum, employee selectiveness is something that plays a very key role. So first, as we're kind of wrapping up here, I want to focus on 2 things. I want to wrap this up with some conclusions. And I also want to take some time to talk about a couple of observations that we've seen that we think are particularly important for people to note moving forward. The first of which, though, on the conclusion side, is that long-term labor markets will likely continue to be an inflationary force. Big picture theme I hope you take away from our presentation today is, if you were to look back over the last 30 years, and I was to describe it from an economic standpoint, we would describe it as an era of plenty. Why? We've had populations globally growing. You began to see one of the largest nations in the world, China, bring hundreds of millions of people into the international workforce. And for the longest time, a lot of people ask themselves the question, why, we've been printing money and doing things that we shouldn't have done from a monetary policy standpoint for a long time. Why have we only seen inflation come about really in the last couple of years? There's a number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is because we have been importing deflation from the rest of the world. We were able to get different products manufactured, goods and services offered from countries that were willing to work for far less than what people were willing to do here in the US. And as a result, for a long time, we did not see the kind of inflation that we otherwise would have seen. Today, though, we are seeing a transition from this era of plenty into an era of scarcity. And we expect that this will last for at least several decades. Why? One of the biggest reasons is what I would consider the breadbasket of employees, which would be China, is seeing its shrinkage. If you were to look closely at that chart that Laura showed earlier, we're seeing China's working age population decrease by 5 to 15 million people per year. And if you look at the overarching statistic, we're expected to see China's working age population by 2050 decline by 200 million people. Let me repeat that. We're expecting China's working age population by 2050 to decline by 200 million people. Just to put that in perspective, that is larger than our entire working age population here in our country. We have about 170, 180 million people in the workforce here in the United States. So that's incredibly significant. And when you have that many people leaving the workforce just in China, that doesn't include Europe or Russia or other countries that are also having a demographic problem, then that's going to cause a lot of issues longer term. And we believe that that one issue is going to cause a series of other issues in which we will see problems with scarcity across the board. There's ways that could be countermanded. You could see a country like India or maybe parts of Africa that have otherwise not been really integrated well into the global economic system. If you could see some countries like that begin to go through that process, maybe that could alleviate the problems. But so far, we're not seeing any concerted efforts by those countries to try to fill the seat that China is beginning to step out of. That leads us to the second thing, which is we should seek to increase our labor markets. Here in the US, there's only a couple of ways we can do that. We can have more children. We can seek to have more people immigrate to this country, or we can find ways to offshore work. And so if we want to see inflationary forces come back to bay, we're going to have to embrace at least one, if not a couple of those options. The challenge with having more children is it takes 20 to 25 years before you begin to see the impact of that, which is one of the reasons why China is not going to be able to stop the demographic winter that they're experiencing there, because you can't reverse 30 years of not having children in a few years. It takes decades to reverse that trend. Third, and this is really important, we need to promote the concept of economic destruction, creative destruction, rather. What is this idea? This is the idea that innovation is one of the best single ways to grow our economy, and also to have actually deflation. Innovation, doing something better, more efficiently, is hands down one of the best things that we can do to fight inflation as a whole, and specifically make our labor markets still remain at more reasonable levels. So I'll give you an example. Why do we call this concept creative destruction? We call it because oftentimes when these kinds of industries first emerge, people have an outcry. We don't want to lose these jobs. So I'll give you an example. At the turn of the century, moving from the 1800s to the 1900s, horse-drawn transportation was still the mainstream. In fact, in the city of New York, one thing that a lot of people don't even think about is literally, if you were traveling around New York City, there was literally horse crap everywhere. Literally, it filled the streets because you had so many horse-drawn vehicles going throughout the city, to the point that it was actually one of the major factors that pushed the adoption of cars as a more common vehicle that would be used as opposed to the horse-drawn buggy, because they didn't want to have to deal with the crap on the street anymore. But when this first started to happen, a lot of the industries that supported horse-drawn vehicles began to outcry and said that this policy will destroy jobs. The people who made the saddles and the bridles and the carriages, these individuals said, this is going to destroy our jobs. This is a bad idea. And they weren't wrong. In the short term, those individuals would be displaced. But what that ignores, though, is that when you have innovation like that, Longer term, it creates efficiency, and it ultimately creates more jobs than you usually would have taken away in the first place. So, while you didn't have those same jobs anymore, now you had jobs selling cars, extracting the oil and gas necessary to fuel those cars. People were more efficient with their time longer term. They were able to accomplish journeys at, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times the speed that they were with a horse. And as a result, they didn't have to spend as much money on their vehicles, and they were able to spend that money on more productive things. We as a culture need to embrace creative destruction. We need to embrace innovation, because innovation is one of those things that has the ability to fight deflation. If you look at the areas today that have the highest inflation, there are areas like healthcare and education. What are some of the areas that have the highest deflation? It's things like electronics. Why? Because we have innovated consistently. The cost for a computer, a big screen TV, they are even way lower than what they were 20 or 30 years ago, without even taking into account the difference in quality that you get today that you didn't have before. And that's really key. The last area that I want to wrap up with here is that tight labor markets lead to inefficient capital deployment. Businesses have to have certain positions. And unfortunately, when you have a tight labor market, it oftentimes forces employers to pay more for a position than they really ought to. And some people are like, well, hey, that's a good thing because that means the employee gets paid more. Yes, for that particular employee, it's a better thing. But what it also results in, though, is you also see the cost of that good or service go up over the long term, which unless situations, wages rising are good when the value that work does increases. When it doesn't happen, that's where you see inflation. And that's really the difference here is we've seen wages grow over the last year or two, but we've also seen the prices of those goods rise just as much or even more over that same period of time. That's the kind of wage growth that isn't positive. Wage growth that occurs because of efficiency increases are incredibly powerful. Wage growth increases that occur because of tight labor markets tend to result in the cost of living for everybody going up over the long term. I want to close out with 2 final points. And this has nothing to do with the labor markets, but things that we feel like that are interesting, that the news isn't focusing on, but we think are big forces in the markets today that people need to be aware of. First, Max, can you help me go back? Thank you. So the first factor here is that one area that a lot of people are not focusing on right now is China. China right now is in one of the worst and has been for several months now, in one of the worst lockdowns that we have seen since COVID. In fact, if you were to look at this particular image, this shows all of the ships waiting in the Shanghai port, waiting to be offloaded. But right now, with all of the shutdowns, it has brought trade in China to a grinding slow point. And the challenge with China right now, and it's always been this way, is that China's Communist Party does not have transparent data, and so it's impossible to trust any of it. But most economists today believe that the Chinese economy is in a recession at this point. And this is one of the major reasons, because the Communist Party still has told its local magistrates and governors that the most important thing to do right now is to stop the spread of COVID. They were bragging to their population when the West was struggling with COVID. Look, our shutdowns have worked. If the rest of the world embraced our totalitarian style of government, they wouldn't be in the mess that they're in. Well, now they're having to eat crow because they are suffering as bad, if not a worse, cases of COVID. And so they're embracing going back to the austere, we're going to shut down everything approach. And that is causing their economy to slow in a huge way. We cannot emphasize enough how powerful of a force that is. There's 2 big impacts to that. First, China is not shipping out goods as quickly as it would, which means supply chain issues continue to remain a problem. The second thing, and this is something that a lot of people aren't thinking about, but if you look at a lot of geopolitical analysts' papers that they're writing right now, China is using 1 to 2 million barrels of oil per day less than they would normally use right now. So if China, or rather when China does get this COVID situation out in control, or if they begin to shift policy and you begin to see the Chinese economy starting to open up, you're going to see more oil and gas being bought by China, which will only be a more inflationary force in that market. So that's a really important thing to be thinking about. The second thing is obviously interest rates moving up. That has impacted heavily mortgage rates across the country. So for those of you who've been watching our webinars for a while, you know, we did an episode on real estate about a year ago. And when we talked about that, we talked about the reasons we believe that longer term, we think that specifically residential homes will likely continue to move up in price. So we still believe that's true. Longer term, we think that there's about a 5.5 million home shortage that needs to be filled because of the problems that happened coming out of 2008. However, when you have a situation like this where literally the mortgage rate doubles or almost doubles over a single year period of time, you will absolutely see slowdowns. I remember back in May of last year, I refinanced my mortgage for about 2.8%. And, you know, just 2 months ago, we hit a high of 6%, or just shy of 6% on the average mortgage rate that was being issued. That means that people were almost paying 3%, or right at 3% more in interest just a year after I refinanced at 2.8%. That's incredibly significant. You think about this: if you're in Austin right now, the median home price is $540,000. Just to make my math easy, going back to that 2 month ago number when we were right at 6, that means at that point in time, people were paying an extra $10,000 to $15,000 of interest that they didn't have to pay a year ago. And so that's causing a couple of things to happen. One, people can't afford as big of a house as they could have afforded just a year ago. The second thing is it's in some cases causing people to decide, we're going to hold off. We're going to wait for interest rates to come back down, or we're going to wait and see what happens. Thirdly, and this is really important for people who are already in a house and are locked into a low interest rate, it makes those people think twice before they consider selling their home. Because right now they've got cheap debt and it's locked in for 30 years or 15 years. Once they make that sale, that's no longer the case. And they're going to have to accept an interest rate that's probably close to double, or at least 75% higher than what they have today. And so we believe that that will cause a slowdown in the real estate market. It's important, though, to keep in mind, though, a slowdown does not necessarily mean that we're seeing a bubble pop. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily seeing prices drop drastically. Even here in Austin, what we're seeing so far is that while activity is slowing down, instead of having 20 or 25 offers on your house, you're only seeing 5 or 6 offers instead of it being 20 or 30% over asking. Maybe it's 5 to 15% over asking instead. So slowdown does not necessarily mean a bubble is popping. And there obviously will be certain portions of the market, certain portions of the country that will see prices come down. But for particularly a hot market like Austin or your other areas in Texas or other growing areas of the country, even with what we're seeing right now, so far, we have not seen prices drop. In fact, we've seen prices still continue to rise over what they were at the beginning of the year. So we'll keep you guys apprised as we see things continue to unfold. But these were 2 areas that we wanted to make sure we touched on today.
Well, I appreciate that, Josh. Thank you. We are going to go ahead and shift over to questions. As a reminder, if you guys have any question that you'd like us to cover or address, we got about 10 minutes to do so. We have a few that have already come in that we'll review here, but you can send those questions to Max at the Fox Alliance listed here on the screen. So the first question we have, which I'll send to you, Josh, is it seems like a number of large tech companies have recently announced reductions in their staffing or canceling plans to add staff. Most of the new jobs are lower end jobs in the retail sector. Is this true? And are we seeing the job opportunities tilted toward entry level / retail sector?
Yeah, great question. So the latest jobs report would seem to be in line with that narrative. If you were to look at the number of new jobs that were added, there's about 3 areas that we would kind of consider lower end work: retail, hospitality, retail trade, And those accounted for about 30% of the new jobs that were added. And that's obviously that's a much larger percentage than what they are of the economy. And so I think it'd be fair to say that those jobs, at least in last month's report, were more indicative. No, but having said that, though, that's just 1 month. That's a single snapshot. And that's not reflective, obviously, of what we've seen the whole year or what we will see for the next 6 months. Having said that, though, I think here's one important trend to realize, which is when we looked at a survey of CEOs at the beginning of the year, they put the probability of a recession in their mind at 20%. 20% of those CEOs thought a recession was likely. That number has increased to over 60% right now. And CEOs and other management groups that are trying to make key strategic decisions when they believe a recession is likely, they're not looking to do expansive activities. They're looking to keep things tight. Oftentimes, they're going to reevaluate the productivity of their existing divisions. Are there groups that aren't performing? Layoffs are much more common in a situation like that. And so, what I would say is that if the broader leadership teams of major companies around the country continue to believe that a recession is likely, they will continue to act like a recession is going to happen. Even if a recession doesn't happen now, or if it happens next year, they will begin to act like that. And as a result, I think you will see a lot of these pretty well-run companies decide to hold off on some of their expansion projects until they get a better sense of what they think the economic environment is going to be. Versus, as an example, you look at the leisure portion of the market, retail, hospitality. These are areas that have been struggling to find workers for a long time. They're continuing just to try to catch up. I mean, how many of you are still going to restaurants where there's a sign at the front door that says, "We're sorry for the slower service. We're struggling to find people." Those kinds of areas will continue to try to make up for the lack of people that they have been forced to work without for a considerable time. And I think that'll probably be a trend that continues for a while.
Good deal. Thank you. Our last question so far is related to China, and Josh or Laura can take this one. But the question is, hasn't China taken steps to reverse their population decline, such as elimination of the one-child policy? So which of you would like to address that?
Laura, do you? Okay. So China has had the one-child policy for a very long time, multiple decades. And so the answer is yes, they have taken steps to reverse it. They first went to saying, hey, you can have 2 kids. Then they went to, you can have 3 kids. The challenge, though, is guess what? People haven't been having 2 or 3 children. First off, 2 children is not it's a huge change from a percentage standpoint, but that only, even if you could immediately say, boom, everybody in the Chinese population is going to have 2 kids, all that does is stabilize your population. It doesn't actually cause it to grow. And the problem is we're going from a deficit. So the only way to begin to overcome that deficit is actually to see growth take place, which means you'd have to see the average number of children increase per family to at least 3 to begin to even see some of that be countermanded. The other problem is they've literally, the Chinese, whether they realize it or not, have created a culture where having more kids is just not desirable. At this point, people have realized, hey, if I have less kids, I can spend more time doing the things that I want. The other side of it also is the Chinese population has a very strong focus on making sure that their kids are incredibly competitive. An interesting statistic in the Chinese world, 35 to 40% of school-age children go to private school. Private school. I mean, that's an astounding statistic. I don't know what it is here in the US, but it's nothing close to that. And what it points to is that the Chinese are they're very focused on family. They're very focused on making sure that their family makes them proud and represents them well. And that's expensive. I mean, sending that much of a portion of your population to a private school costs a lot of money. And so there's the actual cultural systems within the society make it difficult to promote people having children. I fully expect at some point, and we've actually already seen it to a small level, I expect that the Chinese government will try to create more monetary incentives for people to have children. But we've already seen countries in Europe try to do that. We've got countries in Europe that are literally paying people outside of the medical expenses $10,000+ to have a kid. And people still aren't doing it. Once people are used to doing that, it's really, really hard to reverse that trend. So yes, they're taking steps. They have not been effective. And at this point, you would literally have to have people's behavior change for at least 2 or 3 decades in order to begin to just reverse the massive geopolitical and demographic trends that have started because of what they've done from a political standpoint.
Well, I appreciate that, Josh. I think that's all the questions that we have for the day. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us. We are grateful for the opportunity that we have to serve you and are thankful for your trust in us. If you guys have any questions that we weren't able to get to today, please feel free to reach out directly to us, and we'd love to connect with you on that. Keep an eye out for a survey that we'll be sending out later today. We'd love your input on future topics that would be interesting for us to cover, and also love your feedback on how the presentation went today. Again, thank you for your time, and you guys have a great rest of the week.